Western music is divided into 4 eras. From earliest to latest, they are Baroque, Classical, Romantic, and Modern. Today, we'll be learning more about the second era, the Classical period. The term classical music can be used in 2 different ways. It can refer to the formal music tradition of the Western world, distinct from folk or pop music. Or it can mean music written during the classical era that lasted from 1750 through 1820. Today, when I'm referring to music or composers of the formal Western tradition, I will label them Western. When I'm referring to music or composers from the time period of 1750 through 1820, I will use the term classical. In 1748, just 2 years prior to the beginning of the classical era, the remains of Pompeii, an ancient Roman city destroyed by an eruption of Mount Vesuvius, were discovered. This fascinating archaeological find prompted a renewed interest in the arts of ancient Greece and Rome, also known as the classical arts. The musical era of this time is called classical, while the eras of art and architecture of this same period are called neoclassical. The prefix neo means new, indicating the revival of the classical arts. You may recall that the art, architecture, and fashions of the Baroque period were dramatic, elaborate, and highly ornamented. In contrast to the Baroque artists, the artists of the neoclassical era used a more serious academic approach. Notice the graceful, smooth, and polished style of sculptor Antonio Canova. His subjects are from classical mythology. This sculpture, known as the Three Graces, depicts the 3 daughters of Zeus from Greek mythology, each of whom is described as being able to bestow a particular gift on humanity. From left to right, they are Euphrosyne, who granted mirth, Aglaia, who accorded elegance, and Thalia, the bestower of youth and beauty. Napoleon Crossing the Alps is a famous painting finished in 1801 by French artist Jacques-Louis David. Notice how your eye is drawn to Napoleon's face right here in the center. His expression is confident and authoritative, and the strong diagonal lines of his arm and the horse and these clouds in the back give motion, action, and tension to the piece. These elements are typical of neoclassical style. Neoclassical architecture is very familiar to citizens of the United States, as many of our Capitol buildings are built in this style. It is characterized by grandeur of scale in the form of the central, towering rotunda. Simplicity of geometric forms without much ornamentation, and Greek columns that stand in the entrance with authority, and a preference for blank walls. The simplicity of these designs are in direct contrast to the extraordinarily complex and ornate Baroque architecture. Although still elaborate according to our modern tastes, fashions of the classical era were simpler than the Baroque era. People grew tired of the complexity of the music, literature, and art of the Baroque era. Less is more was the revived idea from classical Greece and Rome. Whereas Baroque music was very dramatic, music from the classical era took a more academic approach. Order and reason was valued above drama and emotions. During the Baroque era, music was elaborate and heavily ornamented, but during the Classical era, it was graceful and simple. In keeping with these characteristics, music from the Classical era is typically homophonic. Homophonic music consists of a melody accompanied by a simple bass line. The melody of the piece is of supreme importance. Unlike Baroque music, the melody can often easily be sung. Because of this overall simplicity, dynamics and phrasing become much more important when performing the piece. Notice in the first two lines of this Mozart sonata that the treble line, which is the melody, is actually quite simple, with one small trill right here in measure 4. When played, the notes in the right hand should ring out over the bass accompaniment. Harmony of the Classical era often consisted of Alberti bass progressions, which we see in the first 4 measures of this piece. The Alberti bass consists of a 3-note chord, which is played in a low note, high note, middle note, high note pattern. Whereas Venice, Italy was the center of Baroque music, Vienna, Austria was the center of classical music. Most classical composers spent time in Vienna. Today, it is still considered the capital of classical music. Some of the more famous composers from this era are Ludwig von Beethoven, a German composer whose music crossed over into the next era of Western music, the Romantic era. Franz Joseph Haydn, affectionately called Papa Haydn by many, was a friend and mentor of Mozart and a tutor of Beethoven. Franz Schubert was from the important city of Vienna. Although he only lived to the age of 31, he left behind a vast collection of works for us to enjoy. And the composer we will study in more detail today, Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart.